So what is the difference between manhwa and manga? They both mean comics, and the words come from different places. So in the West, we're outside of Japan, we're outside of Korea, we're outside of China. How do we know what to call manga and what to call manhwa? So hey guys, I'm Brandon Chen. I'm a professional author in the manga and manhwa space. I also do novels, video games, and Western comics as well. And I'm serialized with a lot of the major manhwa companies in the West, like Naver Webtoon, Kakao Tapas, Bilibili from China. So first things first, I want you to like the video for the YouTube algorithm. That really helps boost the video. And comment what your favorite manhwa or manga is at this particular time. And subscribe if you're interested in learning more about this space, the manhwa manga space, or just like what it's like to be a creator, or if you want to be a creator, like how you can kind of break into the industry. And that's just in general for everything manhwa, manga, and anime related. Now let's get into the video. Let's start off with the terms manhwa and manga and where these words originate from. So manhwa is a Korean word. We typically associate that word with Korean webtoons, which are colored, serialized, vertical, and optimized for digital format. So these would be series like Soul Leveling, God of High School, Tower of God. I would even say that some American comics like The Beginning After the End and my own series God Game fall into that style and format of manhwa, Korean manhwa. And ultimately, like a lot of the publishers that I work for are ultimately Korean publishers, so usually it just feels like it falls under that category anyway. For manga, I feel like everyone kind of knows what it is at this point. It's Japanese comics, which are typically series such as Naruto, Dragon Ball, One Piece, Demon Slayer. A lot of these series are the source material that power anime. Even though that's no longer the case, that only Japanese manga are the stuff that's powering anime. Now it's like Star Wars and Soul Leveling is getting an anime, so kind of anyone can go into anime at this point, but Japanese manga was the primary source for a long time that fueled a lot of these anime series. Now, typically manga is black and white and optimized for print format because the panels are focused on more of a horizontal art style. There's also Chinese manhwa, which is basically the same thing as Korean comics, right? They're colored, vertical, digital format. The only difference, in my opinion, is that it's from China. And so stuff from like Bilibili or Tencent, those are just manhwa, which sounds the same, but it's spelled differently. But no need to worry about that. It's not that complicated. For now, we're focusing on Korean manhwa and Japanese manga. So let's take a look at Korean manhwa, right? How do Korean manhwa and webtoons, serializations, how do those work? So American productions of Korean manhwa are typically 50 to 60 panels in length for webtoons, and this is for narrative series. Like if you're a comedy series, then usually you can get away with a lot less panels. In China and Korea, for narrative series like action titles, like Soul Leveling, for example, usually it's a little bit higher, so it's 60 to 70 panels per week. And the reason is that the artists there are simply built different and they probably have a higher pain tolerance than the folks in America. But guys, I want to emphasize, this is serialized weekly. That's a lot of work. I work on teams that are 50 to 60 panels, and we have like 10 people on some of these projects, and even then it's like pretty hard to meet deadline just because of how intensive the art is and also the workload. Now, Japanese manga serializations are a little bit different because they can be weekly, bi-weekly, monthly. It really depends on the publisher and the magazine that it's serialized in. And they're also like pretty different in terms of like how many pages they launch per release. So one chapter might be 18 pages, but like a pilot chapter is usually like 50 to 60 pages. And if it's bi-monthly, if it's bi-weekly, then usually sometimes it'll be a little bit longer. Like it really depends on the magazine, so it's a little bit more flexible compared to Korean webtoons. But if we're looking at like the mainstream Shonen Jump, right, like the main line, that the workload between Korean manhwa and Japanese manga is pretty similar, because if you think about the average panel rates per page, so if you're doing like 20 manga pages weekly, for example, on average, I would say that 5 panels go onto a page on average. Sometimes there's more, sometimes there's less. 5 is the average. So if you're doing 50 panels a week for a Korean manhwa or webtoon, then that's around 10 pages of manga content. However, Korean manhwa is colored, so that's the extra step that's a little bit more intensive than manga. So I kind of think of it as like almost an equal step. If you're coloring is a ton ton of work. So if mangaka were asked to color their entire series, they would not be able to do it just because of how much work it would be. It would just change the entire medium anyway, so it's probably not worth it. But yeah, I would say that the serializations on average are typically like very similar in the amount of work that they have to do. Now let's talk about story, right? What are the differences in Korean manhwa and Japanese manga in terms of stories? A lot of them kind of feel similar. They target like similar audiences, like people in the West. Like if you like Korean webtoons, you probably also like Japanese manga, vice versa. You know, Japanese manga has a few gems, right? There's like stuff like One Punch Man, Chainsaw Man, it's a lot of men. Blue Lock, right? Like Fruits Basket, whatever, those types of manga that are different, they feel fresh, and they've really hit hard with an audience and have really established themselves as very powerful intellectual properties globally. But there's also a lot of garbage that's out there as well. So I'm talking usually about isekai, and I know that a lot of people like isekai, but I have not. It's not like the best form of literature, if I'm going to be honest. It's enjoyable to consume. Some of them are enjoyable to consume, but objectively is not like the pinnacle of literature, right? But I would say that some of them are okay. Some of them are okay, for sure. I just wouldn't like compare, like you compare like Chainsaw Man, which is like something that has revolutionized manga, right? And then, or like Vagabond, for example, and then you compare it to isekai, it's like kind of hard, you know? But that's just my opinion, But there's a lot of isekai titles out there, a lot of harem titles, yikes. And I would say that Korean manhwa has that kind of similar thing where there's a lot of titles that feel very similar and very like generic. And so there's a few good series out there, right? Like The Boxer, Sweet Home, Omniscient Reader, God of High School, etc. that have really established themselves. But then there's also a lot of like really generic titles out there, such as like the trope where there's like an overpowered character that's dealing with a bully, and there's like a big bullying crisis in Korea. I don't know how there's so many Korean bullying series. Like they must have a serious issue over there if there's like an entire genre on just like people getting their crap kicked in on a daily basis in like middle school and high school. Like it's kind of crazy. Or also system leveling series, which is a new type of genre that has appeared particularly after the rise of solo leveling, which has really pioneered the space. I feel like it's very similar with Sword Art Online and Isekai, you know, for Japanese manga. Solo leveling created this kind of new, not new, but like this uprising popularity in developing system power leveling series. Some of them are good, but a lot of them feel like the same, right? So it's a similar thing to Japanese manga, where both manhwa and manga have, you know, a few series out there that are absolute gems, like really killing it in the space. And then there's a lot of stuff out there that's just kind of like, you read it for fun, but you're probably not gonna remember the plot in a year, I'll tell you that. I'd say on average that Japanese manga has a larger filter though for innovative storylines from what I've seen. There's a lot more diverse stories that are coming out of Japan, but I would say that Korean manhwa is trying to get to that point. They're working on it. Right now it's starting to find its international footholds, right, in America and in the West and in Europe, etc. It's becoming a lot more popular, and they're starting to think about how they can find the next set of like really big time bangers for the Korean manhwa space. And they're thinking about how they can innovate certain titles, right? And the reason I know this is because I work with Korean publishers directly, and so I'm telling you a little bit of their little secrets. So, yeah, that's what they're trying to do, right? Because ultimately their rival competition is Japanese manga for people's attention. Now, that's a little bit about the story. Let's talk about art style comparisons. I'd say that Korean manhwa, on average, is a little bit less detailed than Japanese manga. And that's because of the color, right? Doing a lot of color is just a really big, like, amount of work. So on average, like Korean manhwa, the line work is a little bit simpler. There's also a lot of pre-developed assets that Korean manhwa artists will use in Clip Studio Paint, for example. We creators typically use assets from Clip Studio Paint to make the serialization process a lot easier, right? You can just kind of click and drag an asset and drop it into a webtoon, and boom, you're done. Like a lot of these buildings that you see in the background, or like backgrounds in like forests, background characters even, a lot of them you can just kind of import them, and that's why sometimes in Korean webtoons, like particularly romance series, I know that this is like a big thing, you'll see that some assets are so similar across different series or even the same, and that's because the artists are literally just taking assets from a library and just slapping them into the webtoon. And it makes sense. You have to do it sometimes because you want to meet these serialization deadlines, and optimally, if you have to draw the background every single time, you're gonna die. So, you know, if it saves time, it saves time. And usually the readers just kind of gloss over it. Manga's a little different because they don't usually use the same assets. Sometimes they use photo bashing to create backgrounds that they don't have to draw from scratch and they feel kind of more realistic. But even then, the artist has to have the copyright to those backgrounds. So either they have to purchase the asset, like the photo, or they have to go to the physical place and take photos themselves, which is a pain in the ass because then that means you're not in the chair drawing, so that's time suck. And I would say that on average, manga, like the line work, is typically more precise and meticulous than Korean manhwa, and that's because obviously there's no color. They only see, as readers, we only see the line work and the tones, so it has to be more detailed on average. But yeah, I mean, that's a pretty big generalization. I would say that, you know, if you're comparing shonen manga, something like One Punch Man by Yusuke Murata or Vagabond or Slam Dunk by Takehiko Inoue, right? There's a lot more detailed manga art styles than if we compared like that to like a shoujo manga, right? Then if we were to compare that to like a shoujo slice of life manga, right? The same really goes for Korean action manhwa like Soul Leveling or Jungle Juice. Like if you're comparing those titles to like something like True Beauty, right? Like the action titles usually are more artistically intensive. That's just how it is. And so, I mean, across manga and manhwa, you'll see that action titles or heavy narrative titles are just more artistically heavy than when you compare them to like, I don't know, like shoujo or romance, slice of life type series. Just because I think that you can get away with it. With the readers, right? The readers are more accepting of like more chill or less detailed art style for those genres than like for action titles where people want something to feel very cinematic. Whew, that was a lot, but hey, you know, that's my take on the Korean manhwa and Japanese manga differences. You know, I always see people calling webtoons manga on the internet, and so this video was kind of in response to like all those comments that I always see, kind of to try and specify where these terms come from. Ultimately, they all mean comics, so it really doesn't matter at the end of the day. But usually, yeah, I mean, you call Korean comics manhwa and you call Japanese comics manga, right? And it actually doesn't matter where you're from if you're a creator of these projects. You know, you can be American or French, for example, creating manga in the black and white style that, you know, would fit for a Japanese manga publisher, and I would, you know, we'd still call that manga. But you could also vice versa be French or American and be creating vertical scroll webtoon comics optimized for the Korean format and still be calling that Korean manhwa as well, right? Either way, these are just two different types of mediums of art that originated from their respective countries, and so usually you tie those terms to those different mediums, right? I would say that those mediums are very different because, right, one's colored, one's not, one's for print, one's for not for print, one's optimized for digital and you scroll on your phone, the other one's like you don't scroll on your phone, it's like you flip pages, right? So it's just different, and I wouldn't want to like lump them all into this one overall category of like manga. They're not all manga because, you know, the Korean one is very different in terms of everything and culture and everything. So, but yeah, hopefully you guys learned a little bit about manga and manhwa today. If you did, make sure to smash the like button and subscribe for more content like this. Share with a friend, and also let me know what kind of like more educational mangaka or manhwa content that you'd like to see in the future, and I'll try and make it if it makes sense. And yeah, until next time, guys, thank you guys so much for watching. Peace.